Ancient Egypt is remembered as a land of timeless grandeur, the pyramids rising against the desert sky, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the names of pharaohs carved in eternal hieroglyphs. We imagine rulers as god-kings, embodiments of divine order, standing between heaven and earth. But Egypt was not always a kingdom of stability and glory. By the time of the Ptolemies, the dynasty of Greek origin that ruled after the conquests of Alexander, the old majesty of the Nile, had faded into fragile survival. Its pharaohs were not builders of pyramids or conquerors of empires. They were monarchs, struggling to hold a throne, often clinging to power through bribes, manipulation, and the favor of Rome. At the center of this decline stands Ptolemy XII, remembered by his people with a name that mocked him, Auletes, the flautist. Unlike his ancestors who forged Egypt into a Mediterranean power, Ptolemy XII became infamous for corruption, extravagance, and weakness. He played not only the flute, but also the dangerous game of politics, and in the process squandered Egypt's independence. His reign was marked by scandalous payments to Roman senators, the emptying of temples to fund bribes, and the neglect of his people's suffering. While the Nile still flowed and the temples still stood, Egypt itself became a pawn in the hands of Rome. For the Egyptians, the pharaoh who should have been a god was instead a reminder of decay. This is the story of the most corrupt pharaoh in Egyptian history, a tale not of grandeur, but of decline, not of triumph, but of survival, bought at a terrible cost. It is the story of Ptolemy XII and of the Egypt that fell with him. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear, and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. A kingdom of two faces. By the time Ptolemy XII came to power in the 1st century BCE, Egypt was no longer the empire of the pharaohs who had built pyramids and conquered lands across the Near East. Instead, it was a kingdom of contradictions, dazzling wealth on the surface, but fragile foundations beneath. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals nearly 3 centuries earlier, had blended Greek and Egyptian traditions into a single monarchy. In Alexandria, scholars, philosophers, and mathematicians filled the libraries with knowledge, while temples to Egyptian gods still rose along the Nile. The court wore Greek clothing and spoke Greek, but the people of the countryside clung to Egyptian traditions and languages. It was a kingdom caught between worlds. This duality was a source of strength, but also of tension. The rulers were Greek in blood and culture, yet they sat on the throne of the pharaohs, presenting themselves as divine to the Egyptian people. Many accepted this as tradition, but beneath the surface lay resentment. The dynasty often felt foreign, distant, and more interested in luxury than in the hardships of the farmers who toiled to feed the nation. The long shadow of Rome. At the same time, a new power had risen in the Mediterranean, Rome. What had once been a small city-state had grown into a formidable empire, stretching its influence across Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's shadow stretched even over Egypt. Egypt still had its wealth, fertile land watered by the Nile, immense grain harvests that fed entire populations, and temples filled with treasures. But this wealth was also its weakness. Rome's senators and generals knew the value of Egyptian grain, and they knew that whoever controlled Egypt could wield immense power in the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies, weakened by generations of internal strife, were no match for Rome's ambition. Already, Egyptian rulers had begun paying for Roman support, offering bribes to secure recognition of their legitimacy. Pharaohs who had once stood as gods now found themselves reduced to clients, struggling to buy the favor of men across the sea. A fragile throne. It was into this world that Ptolemy XII stepped. He inherited not the glory of the new kingdom, but the crumbling throne of a dynasty that had traded independence for survival. His crown gleamed with gold, but its weight was heavy with debt. His temples still performed rituals of divine kingship, but whispers in Alexandria spoke of corruption and decline. The pharaoh, who should have been the guardian of Maut, the sacred balance of order and justice, was already entangled in Roman politics. Even before his name became synonymous with bribery and weakness, the throne he inherited was already trembling. And so Ptolemy XII began his reign not as a king of power, but as a monarch walking a tightrope, adored in ritual, doubted by his people, and bound to a foreign power that could decide his fate. A kingdom of two faces. By the time Ptolemy XII ascended the throne in 80 BCE, Egypt had become a paradox. On the one hand, it was still one of the wealthiest lands in the Mediterranean, nourished by the endless fertility of the Nile. Year after year, its waters flooded the fields, depositing the black silt that fed a kingdom of farmers. From this abundance came grain shipments that could sustain entire nations, and in particular Rome. Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. On the other hand, behind this surface of prosperity lay weakness. The Ptolemaic dynasty had been in power for nearly 3 centuries, since the time of Alexander the Great. These rulers were Greek by origin, Macedonian in blood, and they had built their capital in Alexandria, a city of marble colonnades, libraries, palaces, and theatres, more Hellenistic than Egyptian. To the scholars who filled the great library, Alexandria was a beacon of knowledge and philosophy. To the Greek elite who dined in its symposiums and debated in its academies, Egypt was a jewel polished by Greek culture. But to the native Egyptian peasants who lived in the villages along the Nile, who tilled the land and prayed in ancient temples, the dynasty often felt distant, foreign, and corrupt. They saw pharaohs who spoke Greek, who worshipped foreign gods, and who cared more for luxuries than for the sacred balance of Maat, the divine order of justice and harmony that true pharaohs were meant to uphold. Thus, Egypt was a land divided, Greek and Egyptian, rich and poor, marble and mud brick. It was a kingdom of two faces, glittering in Alexandria but fragile in its foundations. The long shadow of Rome. This fragility became more dangerous as Rome's power expanded. In the centuries before, Rome had risen from a city-state to a Mediterranean empire, defeating Carthage, conquering Greece, and spreading across Asia Minor. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer just another power, it was the arbiter of kings. Egypt, with all its wealth, drew Rome's gaze like a flame attracts moths. The grain of the Nile was essential to feed Rome's growing population, and its gold could buy the loyalty of armies. For ambitious Roman senators, control of Egypt meant influence that could tilt the balance of power in their own republic. The Ptolemies understood this reality, but their response was not strength. Instead of resisting Rome, they sought to appease it. Pharaohs began sending enormous bribes to Roman officials in exchange for recognition of their legitimacy. In effect, Egypt's independence became a commodity. Kings who had once been seen as divine now begged for approval from men across the sea. This was the Egypt inherited by Ptolemy XII, a land outwardly rich but politically enslaved, a kingdom where the throne itself could only be secured by Roman favour. A throne in crisis. When Ptolemy XII came to power, he did not inherit the stability of an eternal dynasty. He inherited a throne already cracking. The Egyptian people doubted their rulers, resenting the dynasty's foreign roots and its increasing dependence on Rome. The priesthood, once the foundation of royal legitimacy, grew skeptical as temple treasures were melted down to fund bribes, and the nobility of Alexandria, ambitious and divided, whispered behind palace walls about corruption and decline. Even the rituals of divine kingship performed faithfully in the temples could not disguise reality. The people still bowed before the pharaoh, still carved his name in hieroglyphs, still honored him as a living god. But beneath this ritual reverence was disappointment, even contempt. The image of Pharaoh as protector of Maat was contradicted by the visible reality of misrule. It was in this climate that Ptolemy XII began his reign. To his subjects, he was already a symbol of fragility, a king who ruled more by foreign gold than by native trust. To Rome, he was an opportunity, a monarch desperate for support, willing to pay almost any price to keep his crown. The prelude to corruption. Thus, before Ptolemy XII ever lifted his flute, before he earned his infamous nickname Olutes, the stage was already set for his corruption. His reign would not be remembered for great temples or military victories. It would be remembered for debts, bribes, and the slow surrender of Egypt's sovereignty. He wore the crown of a god-king, but it was already tarnished. The Nile still flowed, the temples still rose, but the throne of Egypt trembled. And at its center sat a man who would squander what remained of his kingdom's dignity in exchange for the fleeting favor of Rome, the price of legitimacy. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs had claimed their authority as divine. Their crowns symbolized eternal rule, their names carved in stone as if they could never be erased. But by the 1st century BCE, the crown of Egypt no longer carried the same certainty. The throne was no longer secured by the blessing of the gods alone, but by the approval of Rome. Ptolemy XII understood this better than anyone. His reign did not begin with triumph, but with bargaining. To secure recognition of his rule, he turned not to the temples or the army, but to the Senate of Rome. There he found senators eager to listen, not out of respect, but out of greed. Bribes became his greatest weapon. Gold from Egypt's treasuries flowed into Roman hands, buying declarations of legitimacy, promises of protection, and endorsements that allowed him to wear the crown. Pharaoh, once seen as a god, was now reduced to a client of Roman politicians. The draining of Egypt. The cost of these bribes was staggering. Ancient sources suggest that Ptolemy XII paid vast sums, emptying his treasury and even selling off the treasures of temples to meet Rome's demands. Statues of gods were stripped of their gold coverings, sacred ornaments melted down, offerings diverted from rituals to Roman senators. For the Egyptian people, this was not just corruption, it was sacrilege. The pharaoh, who was supposed to uphold Mat, the divine balance, was instead dismantling the very symbols of the gods to buy foreign approval. Every shipment of gold to Rome was a visible sign of decline, a wound in the sacred fabric of Egyptian life. Meanwhile, in the countryside, farmers struggled under heavy taxation. Grain was taken not to feed the people or the gods, but to line the pockets of Rome. The Nile still flooded, but its bounty no longer nourished Egypt, it nourished corruption abroad. The Roman puppeteers. In Rome, Ptolemy XII's dependents made him an object of ridicule. Senators saw him not as a king, but as a client to be exploited. Cicero sneered at him as weak and undignified, a monarch who preferred music to statecraft, bribes to justice. For Roman statesmen, Egypt's pharaoh was not a ruler to respect, but a purse to plunder. Yet this ridicule did not stop them from taking his gold. On the contrary, Ptolemy's desperation made him useful. Whenever his position was threatened, he paid more. Whenever rival claimants to the throne emerged, he bribed again. His reign became a cycle of payments, each one eroding Egypt's independence further. A kingdom for sale. What made Ptolemy XII infamous was not just his corruption, but the scale of it. He effectively put Egypt itself up for sale. Instead of securing loyalty through strength, he secured it through money. Instead of ruling as a divine king, he ruled as a debtor to foreign masters. The Egyptian people saw this clearly. They called him Alates, not as a harmless joke, but as a condemnation. He was not their protector, but a performer, not a pharaoh, but a parasite. In marketplaces and temples, whispers spread that the king was selling Egypt's soul to foreigners. This discontent grew so strong that rebellion began to stir. The people who once bowed before pharaohs as gods now began to question whether such a king deserved their reverence. The cost of survival. And yet, for all the corruption, Ptolemy XII survived for a time. His bribes kept him on the throne longer than his strength ever could have. In a way, the corruption worked. As long as Rome profited, Rome tolerated him. But survival at such a cost carried its own doom. Every coin spent on senators was a coin taken from Egypt's lifeblood. Every bribe secured the present at the expense of the future, and in the end, the debts would come due. The story of Ptolemy XII's reign is thus not only the story of one man's corruption, but of a kingdom's surrender. Egypt, once the mightiest empire on earth, was now dependent on the whims of foreign politicians. Its ruler had become less a pharaoh than a client, less a god than a desperate debtor. The breaking point. By the middle of his reign, Ptolemy XII had exhausted the patience of his people. Year after year, the gold of Egypt flowed northward into the pockets of Roman senators. Temples were stripped, taxes grew harsher, and the peasants who toiled along the Nile saw little in return. The image of Pharaoh as protector had collapsed. Instead of monarch, the sacred order, Ptolemy represented its opposite: disorder, corruption, and betrayal. For the Egyptians, he was not the heir of Ramses or Thutmose. He was a clown king who squandered their nation's dignity. When news spread that he had paid an enormous bribe to secure official recognition from Rome, resentment ignited into rebellion. The streets of Alexandria, once adorned with triumphal processions, now rang with angry cries. For the first time, the pharaoh was openly rejected. The flight of Altor. Unable to suppress the unrest, Ptolemy XII fled. Around 58 BCE, he abandoned his throne and escaped to Rome, leaving Egypt in turmoil. His departure revealed the truth. He was not a king standing firm in the face of adversity, but a client running to his masters for rescue. In Rome, he appeared not as a ruler, but as a beggar. He sought audiences with senators, offered yet more bribes, and pleaded for their intervention. He promised Egypt's wealth, its grain, its strategic value, anything, if only they would restore him. For the Egyptians, his flight was the ultimate disgrace. Pharaohs were meant to embody eternal stability, but their king had abandoned them like a coward. Even in exile, he became a symbol of decline. Egypt's god-king, reduced to wandering foreign courts with a flute in his hands and debts on his shoulders. The rule of his daughter. In his absence, power did not vanish. His daughter Berenice IV seized the throne. Unlike her father, she presented herself with dignity, claiming legitimacy through Egyptian tradition rather than Roman approval. For many, her reign symbolized a return to native pride, a rejection of foreign dependence. But Berenice's rule was fragile. She lacked the full support of Rome, and Ptolemy's shadow still loomed. To the people, she was a welcome alternative. To Rome, she was an obstacle. Rome decides. Ptolemy XII's survival depended entirely on Roman politics. Senators debated his fate, calculating whether Egypt would be more useful with him on the throne or without him. He poured out what remained of his fortune to secure their favor, promising endless streams of gold and grain. At last, his persistence paid off. With Roman backing and military support, he prepared to return to Egypt. But this was no triumph of strength or justice. It was the return of a debtor escorted by his creditors, a king whose throne was secured not by his people but by foreign swords. The bloody return. In 55 BCE, Ptolemy XII marched back into Egypt with Roman troops at his side. His daughter Berenice IV was captured and executed. Her supporters were crushed. Alexandria, which had once dared to defy him, now bowed again, not out of reverence but out of fear. The return was not a restoration of glory, but of dependence. Egypt had been forced to accept a king their people despised because Rome demanded it. Ptolemy XII sat once more on the throne, but his legitimacy was gone. He was not pharaoh in the eyes of his people. He was Rome's puppet. The legacy of exile. The exile and return of Ptolemy XII marked the final erosion of Egypt's independence. His flight had exposed his weakness, his reliance on Rome had sealed it, and his bloody return had confirmed it. From then on, Egypt was no longer a kingdom with its own destiny. It was a prize Rome would claim outright within a generation. For his subjects, the reign of Ptolemy XII left a bitter memory, a pharaoh who abandoned his people, who killed his own daughter to keep power, and who paid in gold and blood for the privilege of wearing a crown that no longer meant sovereignty, a throne reclaimed but not restored. When Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt in 55 BCE, escorted by Roman troops, his throne was once again his, but the dignity of kingship was lost forever. The people had seen him flee, they had seen him beg for Roman help, and now they saw him return only through Roman steel. The pharaoh who should have embodied divine order sat on the throne as a man propped up by foreign swords. The execution of his daughter Berenice IV, carried out to ensure his restoration, left a scar on the dynasty. To the Egyptians, it was a betrayal deeper than any before, a father who killed his own child to appease Rome and secure his position. Such an act revealed not strength but desperation, the cruelty of a ruler who had nothing left but the fear he could inspire. The shadow of Roman power. From this point onward, Ptolemy XII's reign was inseparable from Rome. Every decision, every law, every tax was shaped by the knowledge that his power existed only because Rome allowed it. He raised heavy tributes to pay his Roman backers, draining Egypt's wealth to satisfy the demands of men far from the Nile. The temples were stripped further, the coffers emptied, the people taxed more harshly than ever. Farmers who once depended on the Nile's bounty now saw their grain taken to fund the endless cycle of tribute. Alexandria glittered with banquets, but in the countryside resentment festered. In truth, Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom. It was a protectorate in all but name. Its pharaoh, a client ruler whose every move was calculated to maintain Roman favor. A court of fear. Within the palace walls, paranoia reigned. Ptolemy XII trusted no one. His return had been bought with blood, and he feared constantly that betrayal would rise again. Courtiers whispered carefully, servants obeyed silently, and advisors tread lightly around a king who had shown he would sacrifice even his own children for power. Banquets continued, music filled the halls, and Ptolemy's flute could still be heard in the evenings. Yet the joy was hollow, the notes drowned beneath the weight of fear. Even his indulgences had lost their charm, for he played not as a man secure in his throne, but as one desperately clinging to it. Preparing for succession. As his health declined, Ptolemy XII turned his thoughts to succession. He knew that without Rome's support, his heirs would not survive, and so once again he turned to his foreign patrons. He named his daughter Cleopatra XII and his son Ptolemy XIII as joint heirs, ensuring that Rome would recognize their legitimacy after his death. Cleopatra, though still young, already showed signs of the intelligence and charisma that would later define her. She watched her father's dependence on Rome with sharp eyes, learning not only the art of survival, but also the danger of weakness. His failures would become her lessons, his submission would shape her defiance. The end of a puppet. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, few wept. His reign had been long, but it left little to admire. No great temples bore his name, no monuments celebrated his victories. Instead, his legacy was one of debts, bribes, and dependence. The Egyptians remembered him as Walates, the flautist, a king who played music while his kingdom decayed. The Romans remembered him as a client who paid them well, nothing more, and history remembers him as the most corrupt pharaoh, a ruler who sold his nation's dignity to keep a crown that had already lost its meaning. The burden of a kingdom in decline. When Ptolemy XII closed his eyes for the last time in 51 BCE, he left behind not a kingdom of glory, but a nation weighed down by debt and humiliation. Egypt still glittered on the surface, the temples of Karnak still stood, the Nile still rose each year, Alexandria still dazzled with marble colonnades, but beneath the grandeur lay fragility. The people no longer trusted their rulers. The dynasty's Greek blood and foreign customs had always been a source of tension, but under Ptolemy XII it had reached a breaking point. He had drained the temples, betrayed his own daughter, and bent the knee to Rome. To the Egyptians, he was not a god king, but a servant of foreigners, a man who had desecrated the sacred balance of Maat. The throne he passed on to his children was therefore not a throne of stability, but of crisis. Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII inherited a kingdom both rich and vulnerable, magnificent and broken. Cleopatra's inheritance. Cleopatra, still a teenager at her father's death, understood the fragile world he had left her. She had watched him beg Rome for survival, had seen the resentment of her people, had lived within a court dominated by bribes, fear, and dependency. She knew what her father had failed to grasp, that Rome was both Egypt's protector and its greatest threat. Unlike him, she would not try to buy respect with gold alone. She would use her intelligence, her charisma, and her own body as weapons in the game of survival. The lessons of Ptolemy XII shaped her reign. Where he was mocked as a flautist, she would be remembered as a queen who charmed Caesar and Mark Antony, who dared to face Rome on her own terms. Where he had surrendered Egypt's dignity, she would fight however desperately to preserve it. The puppet who prepared a queen. Ironically, Ptolemy XII's failures gave rise to Cleopatra's strength. His corruption exposed the dangers of weakness, teaching her that Egypt could not afford passive rulers. His dependence on bribes showed her that Rome respected only those who could wield influence. His death, leaving behind debts and uncertainty, forced her to act decisively. Though he is remembered as the most corrupt pharaoh, his very corruption created the conditions for one of history's most remarkable queens. Cleopatra's brilliance shines brighter, precisely because it emerged from the shadows of his decay. The final judgment. History has been merciless to Ptolemy XII. Unlike the great pharaohs of old, he left no towering monuments, no pyramids, no temples to carry his name through the centuries. Instead, he left only a reputation for bribery, weakness, and betrayal. His memory is bound not to triumph, but to mockery, the flautist king who played while Egypt crumbled. Yet his story matters, for it reveals the last act of Egypt's independence. His reign shows us how empires fall not only to foreign invaders, but also to corruption from within. He stands as a warning, a king who sought survival at any cost, and in doing so ensured that survival would belong not to Egypt, but to Rome. The closing of an era. With his death, the final chapter of Egypt's pharaonic tradition drew near. His daughter Cleopatra would fight to keep the throne alive, but the age of the pharaohs was ending. Within a generation, Egypt would no longer be ruled by kings or queens, but by Roman governors. The legacy of Ptolemy XII is thus not only his corruption but the twilight of a civilization. He was the man who surrendered Egypt's independence, who turned a divine kingship into a client monarchy, and who left his heirs a kingdom already half in Rome's hands, the silence of the pharaohs. For more than 3,000 years, the pharaohs of Egypt had been remembered as divine rulers. Their names were etched into stone, their monuments rose against the desert sky, their images carved as gods walking among mortals. Yet Ptolemy XII left almost nothing behind. No great temples bore his name, no colossal statues stood in his likeness. His legacy was not written in stone but in whispers of corruption. Where once the pharaoh's voice had thundered across the land as the guardian of Maat, his voice was reduced to the sound of a flute, fragile, fleeting, unable to endure. The silence that follows his reign is itself a judgment. A dynasty that began with Alexander's generals, shining in the grandeur of Alexandria, ended in mockery and dependence. The irony of survival. Ptolemy XII's life was consumed by a single desire: survival. He bribed senators, betrayed his people, and even killed his own daughter, all to keep the crown upon his head. And yet in the pursuit of survival, he ensured Egypt's destruction. His survival was temporary, but the consequences were permanent. It is one of history's great ironies. The man who did everything to preserve his throne left a throne that could not endure. His death marked not stability, but collapse. His heirs inherited a crown already shackled to Rome, and within a generation, Egypt itself would be absorbed into the Roman Empire. Lessons from a corrupt king. Ptolemy XII's reign reminds us that empires rarely fall in a single blow. They erode slowly, weakened by corruption within as much as by enemies without. His Egypt was not conquered by Roman legions alone, but by gold, by bribes, by the steady surrender of dignity for survival. His story is not of a tyrant who ruled with cruelty, but of a weak man who ruled with cowardice. And in some ways, that weakness was more destructive than cruelty could ever be. For cruelty can inspire resistance, but corruption breeds apathy, decay, and silence. The shadow of Cleopatra. And yet, out of this shadow rose Cleopatra XII. Where her father was mocked, she became a legend. Where he surrendered, she resisted. Where he begged, she seduced and strategized. She inherited the ruins of his reign and tried with brilliance and daring to hold back the tide of Rome. Her story, though tragic in its own right, would eclipse his history. Remembers Cleopatra as Egypt's last queen, not Ptolemy XII as its most corrupt king. But to understand her defiance, one must first understand his failures. He was the warning she could not ignore. Closing reflection. And so the story of Ptolemy XII ends not with monuments, not with glory, but with silence. A flute played in gilded halls while temples crumbled. A king who survived only by selling the very dignity of the throne he wore. The fall of Ptolemy XII is the fall of Egypt itself, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can be undone, not only by conquest, but by the weakness of their own rulers. His life is a testament to the danger of survival without honor, of power maintained by corruption, of crowns bought with gold rather than earned with justice. As we close this scroll, we do not see him as a pharaoh of majesty, but as a cautionary tale, the most corrupt pharaoh in Egyptian history, a man whose flute still echoes faintly in the ruins of a fallen kingdom. And so the scroll closes on the tale of Ptolemy XII, a pharaoh remembered not for glory, but for corruption, for the flute he played while his kingdom slipped into Rome's hands. His story reminds us that even the mightiest empires can fall, not through conquest alone, but through weakness within. If this story has given you something to reflect upon, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons do you see in the fall of Ptolemy XII? If you found meaning in this journey, a simple like helps these forgotten voices reach others. And if you wish to walk again through the shadows of history, subscribe so together we may continue to unroll the scrolls of the past. Until the next story, thank you for watching, Scroll Historian.